Well, let's get started. I'm Ladd Tobin, and I am a member of Tim's committee, along with my colleague here at BC, Paula Matthew, and Eric Gordon, who's in the Department of Visual and Media Arts at Emerson College. And we're all very happy to welcome you. Some of Tim's colleagues and friends from the English department, and colleagues and friends from instructional design, and friends from other places. I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves in a moment. I just wanted to especially welcome Tim's parents, Clayton and Emily Lindgren. Hi.
Oh, no sound.
Can they hear us yet?
You want to say hi?
Hi. Well, we're so glad to welcome you and have you here with us. It's always a wonderful thing to have family at these occasions, but it's especially fitting because anyone who's read Tim's work knows how much he talks about how important it is to build and sustain communities, and especially how new media, rather than getting in the way of that, could actually be a way to sustain that. Also, any of us who have read Tim's work and seen him teach know how much he talks about how it's hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you are now and where you've been. And so we're really happy to have you here from Fargo, North Dakota. I hope you're staying warm and dry. We've been thinking about you these last couple of weeks too. And we're going to give you a chance to ask Tim some really hard questions after he speaks, so we'll come back to you, but welcome. Before we get into the questioning, there are two things. One is I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves, and the other thing I'll talk about the format. Tim is going to talk for 15 minutes or so about his work, which I think will be especially useful for those of you who haven't had a chance to read the entire dissertation. It's been online. And also we're going to invite you to participate after Paula and Eric and I ask Tim some questions. But the only other thing I wanted to say first is that in some ways defense is a misnomer. And I don't want to spoil all the drama of the moment. If you came here hoping it was going to be like Slumdog Millionaire or a quiz show and we would ask Tim impossible questions about obscure and trivial details, and if he didn't answer one correctly, we would revoke his PhD. That's not going to happen.
Oh,
We've
I
already
have to redo my question.
We've spoiled the drama by Eric and Paul and I have actually already signed off on the quality and quantity and originality of Tim's dissertation and said that it's met all the criteria for a successful PhD. And so what you'll be seeing instead and listening to instead is going to be a discussion of the ideas and implications of Tim's work, but also a celebration of the work he's done here over the past decade, which I think some of you know has already appeared in really prominent journals and in edited book collections and presented at conferences. And in many ways, Tim has already been a full-fledged colleague to all of us, who we've been as likely to go to him for advice on what we're doing with our projects as he has been to come to us. So if any of you want to reintroduce that kind of drama during the Q&A to see Tim squirm a little bit, we won't disallow that, but I didn't want you to be overly tense going into this. So before Tim presents, I would just like everybody to introduce himself or herself, and then we'll get started.
Paula Matthew, and I'm in the English department here.
Alan Augerman, friend of Tim's and Kathy's.
And landscape.
A landscape architect.
Nirmal. I'm also completed my PhD this year, and friend of Tim's.
Kathy O'Keefe, girlfriend of Tim.
Barbara Radke. I'm from the School of Theology and Ministry, and Tim helps with C21 Online, which I manage.
Jason Sepik, an MA student here.
I'm Gloria DeSabato. I got my MA at Boston College years and years and years ago before I met Tim through the blogosphere. I'm one of the bloggers he
I was
talks
going to
about.
say, you're in here.
I've been here, yes,
She represents the subjects, so if there are any issues that they need to bring up collectively, she's going to.
I'm Jeannie Poe. I've known Tim through the English department, and I work with Tim in e-teaching services.
I'm Sarah Castricum. I'm also in e-teaching services. I'm the other instructional designer there, which right now is really kind of humbling.
And as Ladd already mentioned, I'm Eric Gordon, and I'm at Emerson College in the Visual Media Arts Department, and on Tim's committee.
And a neighbor.
And a neighbor, that's right.
Good. Well, thanks everybody for coming, and it's great to have this sort of cross-section of people here. It's from all sort of corners of my life. So it's really nice that you took the time to come. And I just want to give a little spiel here to give you a sense of what the project's like, since most of you, I'm sure, haven't read it. And I think that I've been trying to visualize a little bit some of the relationships that I've been talking about, and so it's giving me a chance to kind of come back around it, to it a bit. And hey Ben, come on in.
Thanks.
There's a spot right here.
That's okay.
You
You can leave it open.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Ben, do you want to introduce yourself? We just went around and did some intros.
Oh, hi, Ben Warren. I'm a dentist, I know.
Not my dentist, but
No.
but all the way from, you're not directly from Alaska at this point, right? You're
Just got back a few days ago,
yeah, okay, so straight from Alaska. Welcome.
Thanks.
So, I want to, I guess for starters, where I come from has sort of been a part of this all along at various stages. And, I'm really just kind of a simple guy from North Dakota. And I've started there, obviously, a long time ago. And I ended up going from Fargo to Chicago, Paula's hometown, and I went to college there and got settled there after college and really loved Chicago, loved where I lived on Newgard Avenue. And then I got it in my head one day that I should go to grad school and give that a try. And then I got in some places and ended up thinking, well, Boston would be a good place to be. I'm young, I'm unattached, why not move across the country and start over again. So I ended up in Boston, and I was pretty miserable for about 3 years, pretty solid miserable, I would say. And I ended up in grad school, and as academics, we often move for whatever stage we're at, and it got me thinking about where I am and what on a sort of personal level. I was feeling very disoriented, and I wanted to sort of figure out where I was, and I ended up changing my directions, moving into nature writing from whatever I don't even remember what I came in as, Victorian poetry or whatever it was. And I ended up doing work in American nature writing partly because it was interested in place and interested in thinking about what is the relationship between who we are and where we are, and and particularly in a kind of ethical way, what does it matter that we have or don't have a relationship with the environment we happen to live in? And so, but alongside of this, I also started designing websites for my courses, and Jeannie is partly responsible for this because she showed me Dreamweaver, and then it was kind of, I was staying up late when I should have been planning my course. I was actually tinkering with my website. And then I started thinking, well, I'm spending all this time online. I'm thinking about web design, and I started thinking, well, maybe there's some connection here. Maybe is there something about the web that can help me connect to where I'm at? And so I started thinking, well, I want to make a website where I can sort of document my explorations of place, and eventually it turned into a blog because I realized that was the right format, and so started blogging. And then eventually I found that I found this group of place bloggers called Ecotone. And it was kind of a moment where I realized, this is not just me, this is something a little bit bigger. Maybe I'm not the only one. These people seem to have responded to a similar urge and ended up online, ended up blogging. And so it made me think about place blogging as a kind of genre and a kind of response to my own personal experience, but also a kind of cultural moment where other people, obviously in completely different places, were finding each other online, as they often do. People do this with knitting or whatever they happen to be in. It's sort of the way things happen, but this happened to be about place as well, and people using the web to connect with place in some way. So it made me think more about that, and that's sort of where this project came from. And I was interested in both sides of things, both place and blogging and why these things got brought together. What is, even in that title, what is that kind of, what's the statement that's being made there? And I mean, we can start maybe by talking about place specifically, and what is it that, what does place mean in this particular moment? You know, what do we think about when we're talking about place? And I think that things are certainly different than the way we used to think. We used to think about place as a kind of bounded, stable place. Your community was your local place, and pretty much your social network overlapped with your physical, the physical dimensions of your local life, and people didn't necessarily go very far from that. I mean, that's a lot, you know, in some ways that's a long time ago, but it's often still the way we think about place and think about community as a stable, unitary kind of thing. But in reality, we've been in this state of what some people, it's kind of an ugly word, but globalization, where we have local, a kind of local identity, but we're also connected with all kinds of stuff that goes beyond that. And so we have our little boxes to some extent, but we go beyond that, and we also are connected in many other situations, whether it's work or other things. But I think we're also in a place where we're really now in a state of network individualism, where, and this is Barry Wellman's term, and he talks about the way that now, instead of being centered, you know, our communication is centered not around like a household. It used to be that a household had a phone, and everybody in that household sort of used the same phone, and that was it was centered around the household. Now we all have our own individual devices. We have our own Facebook accounts. Everything is individualized. And that is also changing our sense, and that's a very mobile sense of self too. People could be anywhere at any given time. And so that's something, you know, we're in this context where the local is changing. What we think about as close to us, what we think as proximate is different. And this is partly the way the network works. It used to, you know, traditionally we think of what's near is physically around me, and what's far away is far, you know, but once you start connecting things in the network doesn't really care where things are. It's all about, is it a node, and am I connected to this node? And beyond that, it's no longer physical proximity, it's a kind of social proximity. Are these people, you know, is this connecting me in ways that are relevant or meaningful to me? And so that ends up shifting what feels like near and far. And so suddenly we have things that, you know, maybe very far away but feel near to us because they're in the network. And so, you know, initially when the web came around, this was the evangelists saw this as we can now transcend our bodies and place is irrelevant. And so one side of this sort of response was, you know, place is no longer something we need to worry about. We're getting beyond this. And then, but you know, the other people reacted to this and saying, well, that's nonsense. We are still grounded in physical places. We have bodies. You know, this isn't going to go away. And so the opposite was to sort of react against place and say, this is killing local communities. This is undermining our sense of where we are, and we need to you know, sort of tune out and not be involved with this in a way that, and so there's this kind of polarized, you know, relationship. Either place was, or the cyberspace was this completely alternative space, or it was a kind of distraction that got depicted in things like The Matrix or, you know, or William Gibson's novels and stuff like that. And so that's something that, you know, there was I think a time, and even when the place bloggers that I'm studying started writing around 2003 or so is when the Ecotone group, in particular, this group that I've been following, started. It was a kind of shift. It was a kind of moment in the web when that way of experiencing things was shifting as things like Web 2.0 came along, where it became very interactive. There were all these different ways to connect. People could contribute more, and it became to sort of saturate our lives in a way that made those boundaries between online life and offline life kind of blur and become less meaningful. And so, you know, it became pretty clear that place wasn't going to disappear because we spent all our time in cyberspace. We still have bodies, and we always will have bodies as far as as far as we can imagine at the moment. Of course that could change, but for the time being, we have bodies. And I got to turn my mom and dad around. See, they already left. They got going.
Can you ask if they can hear you too, since
They're gone.
I want to make sure they're.
Sorry,
not
Mom and
missing
Dad, I didn't mean to leave you out.
this. Can they hear you?
Oh, there he is. Okay. He's there, all right. I forgot to turn you around so you could see the screen. Sorry about that.
Don't turn around too much and I get dizzy.
That's right.
At least go back and show that picture of Fargo.
Oh, see, I didn't have it. Yeah, right. Right, I'll show it to them later sometime.
They'd see.
And so anyway, we got to a point where we've arrived in a new place where I think we could, we're connected in deep ways. We're not gonna, most of us, it saturates our lives, and we are going to be connected in deep ways with the network and with network communications. But we're also embodied, and we're, I think, sort of seeing these things together. Eric's talked about this as network locality, a kind of way of experiencing the web, where both of those things are equally true, both of them, and we're sort of negotiating, what does this mean now that we experience things as near, even when they're far away, and we can access all our digital stuff through our cell phones, and there's a kind of ease to that that's coming to sort of describe the way it is we interact with each other and the way we experience the world. And place bloggers, the Ecotone folks, seem to be a group who was both very committed to place, but also interested, sort of open to thinking through what it means to experience network locality. And this is a quote from Beth Adams. It's fairly radical what we're doing. I think so anyway. We are taking rather old-fashioned ideas about relationship to place and translating those forward into a world dominated by technology. It allows us for the first time in the history of the world to be anywhere. We need to somehow get across that we are grappling with this and its effect on us as human beings, but it's not about rejecting or criticizing the future, but rather about examining a new paradigm and embracing the best of it to create new kinds of place, while sharing all that's wonderful about the natural world wherever we find ourselves, because we ourselves find this grounding interesting and meaningful. So this is a sort of, for me, represents a part of the ethos of place bloggers, that there's a kind of willingness to explore both. There's a commitment to physical places and embodied experience of place, but also a realization that place is much, it's also what happens in our heads. It's the kind of interactions we have around place in various ways. Now, but one of the big, I think, issues is that place is now competing with lots of other stuff for our attention. And this is, it used to be that information was what was scarce, and it was valuable because you needed to, not everybody had it. Some people had it, they could sell it, they could distribute it in certain ways. And now we're in a place where it's actually attention that is something that's scarce, and that everybody's competing for that. And whenever something becomes a scarce resource, it becomes valuable. I had to go online to find this graph because my understanding of economics is so rudimentary that I wasn't even quite sure how to make the graph supply and demand, But anyway, it's sort of, that's the idea. And the web in particular, and the internet in particular, has made the production of information much, much easier. There's almost no, very little cost. And so, and this has just been growing over the last decades to a point where, it is seemingly a crisis for many people. How do we make sense of all this information? And now place is in this context. What is it, competing for this scarce resource that we are all, we know is valuable, but we're having a hard time figuring out how to allocate our attention to the things that matter. So if place is important to us, I've been thinking about this sort of a notion of what would a local economy of attention look like. We could make this analogy to the local food movement, where people who are concerned about the problems of shipping food all over the place, the environmental resources, the sort of effect on communities. What would it mean to sort of take that analogy and think about what does it mean to allocate resources toward a, towards place in some local way. And so I've been playing around with that in this project and thinking about how do we assess the costs of things, because just because things are functioning, as a node in the network, and it's easy, to transcend distance, and it's easy to access our stuff. The actual costs, I think, now get they show up in the cost to attention that we now are having a hard time dealing with. So that's what I want to do. Is look a little bit closer at the way blogging functions in particular as a way of a kind of structure of attention, because what I did and what ecotone bloggers did was sort of turn to the available means around us to sort of meet a social and personal need, to think about, okay, there was some reason we started blogging, and part of it, I think, is that it had particular affordances and it had particular things that suggested it as a way to foster a deeper sense of place. And so what I want to look at is the way blogging emerged, but it didn't emerge out of nowhere, and the same is true for place blogging. It's not, the web is always sort of a combination of new and old, and we can talk about this as remediation. It's one way. Some people talk about this, that new forms collide with old forms, and they sort of form new things, and nothing sort of is completely lost. They always, the traces of those are always there and interacting in interesting ways. So some scholars have talked about blogging as coming from several different ancestral genres. So some of it's journals and diaries, the kind of chronological nature of blogging might come from there. Homepages is a sort of immediate ancestor, just the fact that homepages were one of the original kind of genres of the web. And then editorials and broadsides is another way, especially political blogging pulls that in. And so then from there you get other kinds of blogging that's sort of particular branches of blogging itself that come out of there. And early on, there were filter blogs that were mostly looking at sort of trying to make sense of the web and functioning as a human filter for links and things that might be interesting to other people. But at the same time, there are also online diaries, so people basically just talking about their personal lives online. And those often didn't, they sort of grew independently in some ways. The history of blogging often gets told from the filter blog side, political blogging, technology blogs. That was sort of what got in the news initially. But these online diaries were incredibly popular, especially among women early on. And so that's a whole nother history of blogging that now, they've sort of merged, I think, in the way we think about it at the moment. But so out of this comes another form of place blogging, a kind of local adaptation of blogging. And so what we have here, the way that I've approached place blogs is I started with Ecotone because that's what I ran across first, and it was this group of people who started a wiki, and they got together and they really wanted to talk about place, and that was the whole point. They spent a couple of years writing every 2 weeks on a topic that they agreed on. They would blog on their own blogs and then make links from the wiki, and they spent a lot of time also sort of in kind of meta discourse about what is blogging, what is place, and that became a useful archive for me even after, it ended in 2005 or so, but that stuff became a useful archive and ongoing discussions with people like Lorianne and Fred and other people who have continued to blog quite a bit ever since. But as I was doing that research, I also ran across another group, or sort of what seemed like another strain of blogging that was also interested in place, but approaching it from a slightly different direction. And so I focused on, in one chapter, a guy named Simon St. Laurent from upstate New York, who keeps a blog on Dryden, the town that he lives in, and Lisa Williams, who's actually from Watertown, who's done a lot with citizen journalism, keeps a blog about Watertown, a kind of group blog. And they didn't seem to have any contact necessarily with the Ecotone folks, but they seemed to be responding to a similar need but they were both sort of approaching it by pulling in different genres. And ecotone folks were influenced by nature writing, by the essay tradition, by journals and diaries. They tended to be a little bit more literary in their approach. Often, initially there was a lot of controversy about how much to foreground nature in ecotone. People said, well, we can't talk about nature too much because there are a lot of people who live in the city, they might be alienated, and so there was a lot of discussion about exactly what role that would play. But I think what was important is the way that it was about representing the self in place and the kind of connection between those two. This other group, Citizen, was more journalistic in its approach. It sort of identified with local journalism and was a little bit less personal in nature. It wasn't that there was a personal voice, but it was more about really finding information about a local area that could be useful to other people in that area. And they tend to be oriented towards an audience who was located in that place. And so I ended up sort of just calling them, giving them some terms just to kind of distinguish what seemed to be some different strains. One side I just called essayistic place blogging because of its sort of representation of the self in place, and journalistic place blogging just because of its connections to journalism. And so I'm going to start by talking about ecotone a bit, because that's in the first chapters I talk about ecotone in the way that it is interested in the relationship between self and place. It's sort of, we don't know who we are until we know where we are. And so there's a lot of emphasis on wanting to allocate, how do I figure out ways to use blogging to sort of pay attention to place. This is a real value, particularly in nature writing, where many of us don't know where we are in a basic sense. And so there's an emphasis on using writing in that tradition as a way, a lens for paying attention. And so it's a way to see self and place as sort of intimately connected, the self in place, and as attention as a mechanism for, it's not the only way that sort of this happens, but since we, in many ways, no longer can assume a deep sense of place, we don't stay in the same place very long, we travel, we move and we travel, we sort of have to construct a sense of place more deliberately than maybe we would have in the past, or at least that's the way I felt, was that it was a kind of intentional act, and that's where the sort of blogging becomes a mechanism or a heuristic for doing that. But I think what initially seemed like a kind of, what we can construe as a simple relationship between self and place gets a little bit complicated when you think about what's happening when you put place in the network. So the web has been described by David Weinberg as small pieces loosely joined, and I think this gets at this idea of what happens when you try to put place in. It's no longer this sort of unitary singular thing. It gets broken up into a bunch of pieces. Just make sure you can still see us here. Yeah. And so I like this quote from Chris Corrigan, one of the Ecotone members. He talks about, instead of linking to other places on the net, we're linking to places, period. We draw connections together between elements that we notice in the land around us. Barry Lopez describes this as landscape. When you link together elements of a territory and give them meaning is what makes us intimate and friendly with the land. We might call this, when this happens in the web, we're talking about putting place into the web as objects, and then we interact around objects. We could call this object-oriented sociality. This is what happens in Facebook when we put up our photos. We put up these little things, and then we sort of all interact around it. We comment, and we make connections around that. And so we might have a blog that's sort of a box that might represent Floyd County or might represent some place, but it's actually made up of lots of posts, lots of pieces that are sort of contained there, but they can also float out into the internet and be sort of mixed up and mashed and filtered, and likewise, we have posts, and then on those posts we have more little objects that are attached as comments and have another kind of genre and a kind of form that goes along with it. And now if we think about this more, it's not just if we're thinking about the way the self gets represented, as people in the group started talking about it, they realized that it's not just they're representing place as a collection of all these objects that have kind of accumulate over time. It's also that they have lots of places that they're connected to, and they don't want to necessarily have to identify themselves in any singular way with Floyd County as a sort of exclusion of other places. And so it turns out it's a little more complicated, and they end up, place is not a kind of simple unitary ground for subjectivity or the self. It's a little bit more complicated, but the web turns out to be a pretty good place to manage that. It's comfortable with that. It doesn't have to be. It's designed to make connections with all this stuff. Keep it. And the blog, there's a lot of digital objects that get arranged in particular ways, and the blog is a particular way to do that. And so they sort of work that out as they go along. Now, they also realize that their audience is slightly complicated as well, because they're writing this. The Ecotone group, for the most part, early on, was writing about places, but not necessarily for people in those places. So they were taking advantage of the network to connect with lots of people who were interested in place, and so they end up, they're allocating their own attention to places, but then they're also allocating their attention to other people's places, and there's this kind of circulation of attention. And they benefit from other people coming and visiting their blogs. It makes them motivated to want to keep blogging. And that's there's a sort of benefit to having this outside investment of attention. But they also are concerned with what exactly are they paying attention to, and what counts as place as they go along. This is a sketch by one of the bloggers who uses sketching to pay attention to the places around her. Lots of people use photography as well. And they're really not, they're not interested in place as an alternative to their physical places. They see it as a lens for examining place. But they're caught up in what Stephen Johnson has called the long zoom. And this is sort of a perspective that the web makes it possible to zoom out from way out all the way in. And it makes it hard once you're in that context to figure out at what level zoom are you working with place. And I think the web tends to want to zoom out and make it hard to focus on place. And so it's easy to think about, it's easy to be attracted to the long zoom. And so what happens is they get a little bit nervous about where their attention is going. This is a quote from Maria where she says, she's talking about starting to travel by all these blogs she is following, and she says her walks in the neighborhood become less frequent. I spend a lot less time in my garden even caring about it. Her focus shifts to worlds that came to me first in words only. And this is really intoxicating because she's finding out about all these places that she has never been. So she knows where in London she can get good Lebanese food and other things that have nothing really to do with where she's at. And then she says, even as I was eating leftovers from my fridge because I didn't have time to go exploring restaurants or grocery stores within a wider circle of my physical neighbors. So she starts to realize she's allocating all this attention to other places, and she starts thinking, well, what is this kind of running counter to what I felt like I got into place blogging for in the first place? So this is where we could switch over to the other strain, because in some ways journalistic place blogging offers a kind of solution, I guess you could say. And it does so by saying, well, let's write about place for the place. Let's sort of be more efficient here and say, well, let's have an audience of neighbors and let's have this overlap. So we're all going to be allocating attention to place, but because we're all in the same place, it's, we don't have to worry about sort of stretching or sort of spreading ourselves too thin by allocating place all over the place. And so that's a different, these bloggers really are, while their blogs might get written, might get read by people who don't live there, they're really focused on writing for neighbors and sort of keeping that in mind. They're more interested in some ways in sharing local knowledge than in representing the self. And so it's an interesting kind of contrast, and you could see it as a solution to this issue of, well, if you really want to blog about place, you really should write not only about a place but for a place. That would be sort of the consistent and efficient thing to do. And Simon, makes the argument in some ways that it's a kind of almost an environmental argument. He says, I'm convinced that we're all going to need to know our immediate neighbors more in the future. Why? Because pretty much everything that's made it easy to ignore our neighbors depends on cheap energy. And this is where he almost seems to be saying, well, if you want a real local economy of attention, we need to focus on knowing our neighbors through these blogs that we're keeping and the kinds of interactions we're having online. So, but I don't want to sort of, I want to present that as a solution for this issue that the Ecotone bloggers bring up, because I think Fred First, who is one of the founding members of Ecotone, offers an interesting kind of merger of these two perspectives. And he really is interested in writing, he ends up writing for both local audiences and distant audiences as he goes along. More and more he starts writing for people in Floyd County. And so he has both an audience that he kind of constructs as a visitor and audiences that he constructs as neighbors. And so in this the last chapter, I look at a particular conversation that he has over the course of several months where he starts talking about, there's a controversy about whether his blog is causing people to move to Floyd County. And there's a lot of debate over this because he tends to I think he kind of writes and takes pictures in the pastoral mode to some extent. I mean, it's really a beautiful place. He's a great photographer. He's a great writer. And there's no, it's no surprise that people are attracted to this place as an alternative to suburban LA or wherever they happen to be. And people tell him they read his blog because as a kind of escape. And that is in some ways that is the way the pastoral mode constructs desires for the urban reader. But he's also, he's also making the argument, I'm just writing about what I know, and this is the place that I love. He's putting it in the network, so it's circulating in lots of ways that he can't necessarily control. And some people are saying, well, if you're going to do this, you need to get on planning boards and protect Floyd County from all these people who are going to move in and ruin it for the people who live there. And so part of what he and some other Floyd bloggers say was, well, we'll try to represent the sort of the dark side of Floyd County, the sort of grungy part that we don't tend to write about. But in the end, there's a sort of, I think, a really healthy debate about what is it that makes, what effect might putting place in the network have on actual places? What responsibilities do bloggers have to sort of either make, present a particular picture or maybe just a well-rounded picture of a place, but even more concretely, does it mean getting involved on your local planning board as a kind of, maybe some people will say, well, don't give blogging so much credit. It's not like it's going to bring all these people in. But it seems to me there's some consensus that it does make some difference, and people have moved there because of what they've read. And it's part of the way we construct place these days is by what we read online. So I think Fred is, by the end, he really is writing for both audiences, and he writes in November. I was just looking at some of his more recent stuff, and he writes still in the same kind of in the way that he did in the beginning, where he would take, it was close observation of his own physical neighborhood, and taking pictures of what he knows around him. But he's also blogging about local zoning boards and meetings where they're getting together to talk about spraying around the telephone lines and stuff like that. Really, stuff that would only be interesting to people who live nearby. And so there's a way in which I think he represents the possibility of writing for both a local and a distant audience and having that be a productive thing. I mean, I think that I would see essayistic blogging and journalistic blogging as kind of two ends of a spectrum rather than sort of competing approaches, and that we, in fact, network locality is about negotiating between our the sort of interests we have in our embodied experience of place and the stuff that, the benefits of being in the network. And that's what I think for me this study has allowed me to sort of understand is that this is a kind of ground level view of people, ordinary people working out the experience of network locality and using the available sort of rhetorical tools to do that, and that these things are not set in stone. You know, these technologies don't sort of determine how we use them or the way we think about things, but we also have a role in constructing these things and making them do what we want them to do. And so I'm going to stop because I've gone on too long, but I think that overall, that, you know, what was useful about this was seeing both that there was a kind of cultural moment where clearly people from all over the web at the same time were interested in, there was something going on in the air, I guess, in other words, and there were people who were interested in this and were blogging at the same time. But you could also see that they evolved and adapted to different cultural situations, and it almost like, you know, birds adapt differently because they're in different ecosystems, and you can see this by looking at genre and the way that different genres get pulled in and reused in these different situations. But they end up giving place blogging a nice range of strategies for thinking about who we are in the network and who we are in physical places.
I'll wait for Tim to get back. So I don't have any necessarily overarching question, because you did a beautiful job kind of outlining the entire dissertation. I mean, I didn't have to read it again. You did a great job doing that.
I
but
wish I would have done that earlier.
Yeah, I know. You could have just sent that to me by email. But there's some, one of the things I want you to say a little bit more about that I think is still a bit problematic for me is I like the idea of the local economy of attention. I think that's a really very interesting idea. One of the problems, though, with the way that you talk about attention sometimes is that it's seen in a kind of binary with distraction. And so somehow attention is singular, and it allows us to focus in on something. Whereas there's this other thing called distraction that sort of tears us away from attention. And economies are complex, and maybe maybe that attention gets fragmented and then repackaged as securities and then sent someplace else. But I wonder if you could say a little something about maybe you're falling into a bit of a trap in sort of constructing a binary there, and how you can sort of flesh out the idea of an economy a little bit more to help us understand exactly how people are kind of negotiating this relationship.
Right. Well, I think it was something that came a little bit late in the project, this sort of notion of attention, and so I felt like I was coming at it after I'd done a lot of the research and sort of thought I had a frame for it, and then suddenly there seemed to be a way of making sense of what was happening in the exchanges between them. And I think I felt like early on it was a kind of sense of I want to figure out a way to kind of pay attention to place in some kind of more focused way, because otherwise, if I don't pay attention, I won't have a deep sense of place. And so I need to figure out a way to do that over time in a regular way, and blogging was a sort of a way to do that. But then, of course, it also is an exchange that was complicated in some of the chapters as people started feeling like, what is it that we're paying attention to exactly? What counts as a place? Because you're really paying attention to these digital objects that kind of somehow stand in for place, and they are how much of that sort of counts as opposed to going out and physically walking through the arboretum or something. Is that what kind of attention is it? I guess that's a different kind of, slightly different kind, quality of attention, or a different kind of attention maybe. And it seemed to me that people really benefited from other people coming and reading their blogs, and then that sort of functioned as a motivating factor for continuing this act. If writing a blog post is kind of an act of allocating attention every time you do it in some ways, because you assume that you've gone out and you've walked around and maybe taken some pictures and thought about that experience, and then you've packaged it into this digital object that you put up there. That is an act of attention in some way. But it, I think that the way blogging works is that it depends on audience. You want to have an audience for this stuff. But in order to have an audience, at least at this level, these people are not, they're in the what we call the long tail of the graph. There's all these A-list bloggers who get all the, they might have hundreds of thousands of readers, and then most of the people out in the graph are way out, they might have 10, 15 readers, they might have 50 readers, but they don't have a lot of readers, and so there's more room for interaction. And I would say that, there you get, you have to be reading other people's blogs, which seems to me a kind of way of, in order to be motivated to allocate attention to your own place, you need to be out there sort of reading other people's places and interacting with that. And that's where I think some of the complexity comes. And I don't know that I think that came later for me, sort of realizing this is a complicated exchange, and that in what way does our sort of way of being social revolve around us, saying, I'm now paying attention to you, that my relationship with somebody, if I'm not paying attention to that person, they're less likely to be friends with me.
But see, that's exactly it. That you're not really paying attention to the digital object necessarily. Primarily, what you're doing is you're interacting with the digital object, and then your readers, and then you're reading others, and it's a kind of conversation in a way. And you hope that's what happens. And once it gets to a certain level, it becomes more of a broadcast, and then it sort of loses its as you say, it loses a sort of conversational mode. And I think that's the really interesting part. So that to pay attention to place, you in fact have to not pay attention to place, and you have to dialogue with others. And it's like being in a classroom, and the students might be sort of talking about what was going on, or what is going on in the classroom, and the teacher will say, stop, I need your undivided attention up here. Well, that's not always productive for learning. And so there's, so I think something similar is going on here, where you have this fragmentation of attention, so that it could become dialogic, and so that the place becomes more meaningful, or rather becomes place through that kind of fragmentation.
Right. That it's not all about sort of utter focus on place and nothing else. I think you're right that it is a kind of it's a careful kind of investment in lots of different places, and in a kind of trust in the network to kind of make connections that will come back. It's the sort of network effect. We can do certain things in Delicious, tag things, and it might be sort of useful for ourselves, but often that comes back around as a value for the rest of us, because all these other people are also tagging the same stuff. And then later on we might realize, oh yeah, that's useful because now I can go and find all this material that's already been tagged without me having to sort of to do it. And I think there's a way that place bloggers, by saying technology is both sort of part of the problem and part of the solution, we're willing to sort of accept that and not take the either-or approach. They're willing to say, well, let's explore what kind of network effects do we get by parsing out our attention in various ways and saying, okay, we're going to see what this does, and I'm willing to say I'm going to spend some of my time reading this blog from Davis, California, because this person is really smart about place, and when I read it, I then go back and see my place in a different way, which then feeds into my motivation for putting more digital objects into, sort of into the network, and going out and seeing things in my neighborhood that maybe I wouldn't see otherwise. And I think that this came, late enough that it took a while to kind of start thinking through all the same material through that lens, and seeing that it is complicated, like you're saying. And I think there are so many different exchanges going on that I ended up kind of painting in pretty broad strokes about, in ways that I don't think captured all the nuances. And I think if I were starting again, I would sort of read things differently, through more of that lens to try to
do that. You can start again.
Probably Monday, but
take the weekend off.
Take Saturday off. But I don't know if that sort of answers, if if that's what you were getting at, but it's.
It is. I mean, I love the concept of local economy of attention. I think it's just great, and I just don't think that it was done as well as it could have been done. I mean, I think it's a
Right.
beautiful concept, and it's worth exploring
Yeah, well.
more than you've
If we
done.
looked at the
in this
graph
case.
of my decade,
Yeah.
it would have come towards the end.
Right.
You know, and so it was a bit of a late addition there.
Well, and just picking up on that, because I think it's just very interesting thinking about the current moment as this kind of crisis in the economy of attention. And one thing I was thinking about in terms of reading this whole thing is, if you think about language and the performative effect of language, I was thinking about with blogging, it seems to be both. Is blogging important because of the effects it has on the writer and the habits of mind that it creates in the writer? Is it about not the text itself, but the writing? You talk about it having place and a relationship to place as a process, an ongoing process. So that's more about having this interaction with other writers and other things, but it's more about the effect on the writer. But then there's people moving to Floyd County because of what they read, the effects of local journalism. And so I don't know if you have a sense of which is the more persuasive effect of
Right.
place blogging. Is it about the effect on
The sort of cultivation of a self.
who
through
is a
this-
blogger, who
Right.
pays attention to that kind of
Right.
place?
Yeah, I mean, I think it became more and more of an issue as I I started with this a certain sort of impulse. My own impulse was, I'm gonna pay attention to my place and I'll keep a kind of, I was in the personal the sort of blog as identified with the individual person and representing that person's self in a certain way. And people might comment, and that is a form of sort of interacting around place. But it was more or less about me and representing myself and fostering a certain sense of self. But then once I was reading the people like Simon and Lisa, they were really more interested in sort of blogging as a way to engage with community, and they were concerned with what effect is this information going to have on my neighbors and our ability to figure out what's going on in Watertown or something like that. And that made me more aware of that. And then if the whole community is reading this, or lots of people in the community are reading this and contributing to a group blog about Watertown, then that is a kind of layer of interaction and engagement with place that is placemaking in, I think, a way that might be slightly different from. I mean, it's also true that lots of individual place blogs about JP could sort of also be part of the way people form a sense of what this place is about, especially if they're aggregated in certain ways, and there are more efforts to do this with outside in and other things where people they kind of go out and suck in blog posts based on some geographic area. But I guess I'm more and more interested in the way the network does facilitate civic engagement, and Eric's done more, I think, work on this kind of thing where it's really about how does this stuff help us make places, and even in my own neighborhood, trying to get a website together to sort of help us interact, give us another layer of connection. It's not meant to be a sort of alternative to the Stony Brook neighborhood. It's meant to help us connect, and in fact, many of us won't connect unless we get this thing going because we're just too busy, and we depend on that as our entry point, and then we're going to get together and have barbecues and organize and kind of get things done. But it is so I think that it started in one place and moved to another place, and I certainly could have come at it the other direction, and I think I'm more, in many ways, I'm more interested now because I'm trying to figure out my own connection to my neighborhood in a more kind of civic way rather than a personal way, although that's still there. I have more sort of pressing needs to figure out how to make my neighborhood safe and healthy and that kind of thing. So But I do think there's value to both, because it is there's certainly, I think that nature writing makes a persuasive case that the personal, developing your own sense of personal connection to a place is often then the motivation for political action or civic engagement, and that those things can go together, and often being aware in a sort of as an ongoing practice of how am I dependent on this physical place and the kind of people who I'm connected to because we're in physical proximity, and that's where I think the notion of having a body and being physically sort of grounded is really important as a sort of balance to the network. But the network also is a balance in the sense that my perspective from my physical location is often very limited, and I'm not aware of all those hidden forces that constitute the local, constitute me as a person. All these global forces I'm not aware of make places where they are. None of it's contained anymore. So I think the network is good at helping us figure out how do we, sort of thinking in terms of ecosystem, or thinking in terms of all these connectedness, all these connected things. I mean, so it's a little bit of both, but I don't know if that's sort of getting at what you're.
Yeah, no, it's just something I thought was interesting thinking about. And did your parents go to sleep? Can they still see you? Just wanted to make sure.
Just checking in. You still with us? Okay, good. Any questions? I hope you're getting your questions ready. We're gonna. All right.
Well, just a comment, and I have more questions I can ask, but I just wanted to make a comment. I really appreciated the reworking of this draft and taking your experience into the preface, kind of pulling that into the preface, and the reworked introduction. I think really worked, and it really came out in your presentation today. You're just much more clear foregrounding the importance of this project and where it comes from in this moment and why it's an important cultural moment. And I think that really works. And I just love the end of your preface. I just want to read a little bit to get some of Tim's words in here. But because I wanted you to say lots more about this, but then I thought, well, this is kind of off the topic, but maybe I can get you to riff a little if you want. You say, moreover, as I finish this project, the worldwide economy is in free fall toward what looks to be a deep and difficult recession. At the same time, we appear to be living in a bubble in the attention economy, a period of overheated investment of attention that is leading us toward a crash of its own kind, what we may someday recall as the multitasking crash or the attention deficit, as Walter Kern predicts in his essay, The Autumn of Multitaskers. However, there can be an upside to these trying times if they force us to connect with our friends and neighbors more deeply and help us regain a commitment to living within our means, both economically and attentionally. We will need all the help we can get. And so I really like that, and I think it really sets up kind of the kairos and the importance of your dissertation. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on what a multitasking crash would actually look like. Would that be kind of like a nervous breakdown, or is it really just the upside of people being out of work? And is it the result of the money economy that when people have fewer things to pay attention to because they're out of work and other things, they live a simpler life? Or could we, or especially our students, I'm thinking about our students, just overheat, kind of being too connected and somehow crash in some ways and need rebooting?
Well, I think it came down to this sort of, in the same way that in the end, we have physical bodies that are limited, with finite, we have limited attention. But I think there's something about social networking software and all the sort of speed of all this that it creates the illusion or the sense that maybe our attention is not finite. Maybe there's a way that if we just had our RSS feeds fine-tuned, and if we just had, sort of all our accounts coordinated, we could actually digest all this stuff and make sense of it, and actually have 400 friends, who we have deep, sort of meaningful connections with and a history with, would be there for us in the time of need. And you know, in the end, it doesn't take you long to have to sort of to realize that there's real value to the connections that we make through Facebook or our blog networks or whatever. But there's also a kind of fragility to it, and we just are limited, and we'd only have so much energy and so much time. And I think that's where I feel like for myself, I just I get to this wall where I just say, oh yeah, I don't really have any more energy to give to people, even though I'd like to be friends with all these folks. And that's the way our social networks have always functioned. You know, it's not like we can be more efficient now and maybe sort of have more interactions, but at some point, I see it happening with people who just disappear from Facebook. It's just like they hit a wall and they realize they can't keep up, and they just I think more people are just going to be dropping off, you know. And it was great to kind of get connected with people, but they realize, like, I can't be interested in all these high school friends who I didn't really know very well. And it's like having a reunion. You're in this high school reunion all the time, and you have to sort of pretend to be interested, and it's hard. It's hard to do that, even if you don't mean them any ill will, but it's just, you don't know these people. And this was made known to me in people commenting and wishing me congratulations for finishing the dissertation. And Joey Hediirachi from high school, who I barely knew, I had a lot of AP classes with him, but he came on and sort of disagreed with the entire premise of